First question is for Mr. Gold, and it has to do with the importance of strong public-private partnerships and a good line of communication between NASA and the commercial space industry, particularly on regulatory and policy issues. So, Mr. Gold, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the importance of the NASA Advisory Council's Regulatory Policy Committee.
Thank you, Senator. Public-private partnerships in America are the envy of the world. It is incredible, this really second golden age that we're having in space, due to not just the private sector, but the support that NASA has given, that combination of capabilities. Elon Musk has gone on the record that there wouldn't be a SpaceX if it wasn't for NASA. So being able to combine public and private sector benefits and advantages is so critical. And one of the other aspects that separates us out from foreign competition, other nations, are FACAs, the Federal Advisory Committees, that we have an explicit and official ability to combine private sector feedback and advice. And in this world, as Senator Cantwell just mentioned, where we're dealing with some pretty extraordinarily policy issues, the NAC Regulatory and Policy Committee is really the only place where NASA can go to get private sector feedback that represents not just companies that are new, like SpaceX and Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, but also Boeing and Lockheed, the traditional and terrific space companies that have brought us so far. So having that common ground where both the new and the traditional space companies can come together to advise NASA is just critical and will allow us to leverage the power of the private sector in support of NASA's goals.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to comment on that? Well, thanks. That's a pretty strong statement in favor of their work, so thank you.
The embarrassing thing to me, Senator, is that two of the members of that committee are now astronauts that we had, so I'm falling behind my colleagues who are on that committee, so Audrey Powers and Sureesha Bandla.
No worries. You bring your own qualities to that. How would you say, this is for anyone who wishes to jump in on it, how would you say China and Russia manage their orbital debris? And are there things we can do to encourage them to do more?
So everybody claims that they follow the guidelines that NASA creates and is adopted broadly by the U.S. government, and then it goes and goes to international fora, and people say, we all agree on these guidelines. In practice, do all nations follow those guidelines? Absolutely not. And so that's a challenge. It's one of the reasons when I was the NASA administrator, I got Mike Gold engaged in the Artemis Accords. We needed to use the Artemis program, and I think this is an important thing. We look at the Artemis program, we get all these countries that want to be part of the Artemis program. How do we leverage that to create an international environment that is conducive for the future of human spaceflight? And so we put in there that you had to adhere to the debris mitigation guidelines that are set forth by NASA. And interestingly, everybody has already agreed to that, so nobody could ultimately disagree. But here's the thing, if you want to participate in Artemis, now you're committed. You got to follow these guidelines. And I think, so the question is, how do you compel other nations to follow what the guidelines are? And, oh, by the way, and this is another challenge that we have, as I mentioned in my opening statement, in this country, we have these mega constellations now that are also placing at risk low Earth orbit. And I'm not naming any one, there's a lot of them in this country. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of other countries that have constellations as well. Rwanda, as I mentioned, 327,000 satellites being filed for at the ITU. So we don't have the authority as a nation to turn around and tell other countries, you're not allowed to have your own constellation, when we ourselves are licensing exactly the same thing. Yes. That's it. So the solution set, Ranking Member Lummis, is to recognize that there is a limitation to how much stuff can be put into any orbital shell. There's a limitation there. Once that, and by the way, I don't know that that's been recognized by anybody at this point, but once it is recognized, we need to define what those limitations are. And those limitations can be determined by the cross-section or the size of the satellite, the mass of the satellite. So we think about how much stuff can you put in any orbital regime, And then we say, okay, now that we know that there's a limitation, we've defined what that limitation is, there needs to be a process by which we allocate access. When I say we, there needs to be an international kind of effort to this, where access is allocated in an orderly way. And when the United States gets its allocation, that we, in fact, do allocate in a market competitive way, where we allow access to a number of different companies that are trying to accomplish the same thing, so we don't end up with monopolistic behavior. I really think, if you look at the kind of the way the ITU works for geostationary orbit, I think that might be a good model for low Earth orbit. It's going to have to be, because the other result is this: we're all launching stuff into space, and it's gonna be not good. It's a race.
Yeah.
And when you have a race like this, and everybody's operating, it's the prisoner's dilemma. Everybody's operating to benefit themselves, and at the end, everybody loses. It's the tragedy of the commons, and I think that's what we're facing right now in low Earth orbit. And there is no regulatory regime that manages it appropriately, and there's certainly not an international regime to manage it appropriately.
Okay, so the ITU is...
International Telecommunications Union, it's a subset of the UN.
And would the UN be the proper organization to also be the umbrella organization for this?
Well, so, wow. It's a challenge for sure, because I would say that the ITU works. And I'll tell you why. And Mike and I were just talking about this earlier. There are countries that are at war with each other that want to have a satellite in geostationary orbit, and they go to the ITU to work it out. So it works, and it has worked very well in geostationary orbit. Right now, there is nothing for low Earth orbit, and I think that's a problem.
Does anybody else want to weigh in on this before we move on?
Yeah. Senator, if I may, space should be about joy and discovery, not danger and fear. And per your question about China and Russia, that's what we're getting with their debris. You know, now I'm going to steal from the former administrator there, who would often talk, and we would be remiss if we didn't mention ASAT testing in the context of this discussion, that due to a Chinese ASAT test, there's debris that's still up there, and I believe it was America that had to warn China that there was debris created by their own ASAT test that was threatening their own space station. You know, the former administrator always point that out. So they are not particularly responsible actors. There's Chinese debris that comes down from every launch. We don't know where it's going to land often. In the last couple of launches, it could have even hit America. We don't know. So as Jim was describing, what we need to do, and I don't think the UN is the entity to do it in, at least initially, we need to do what we've done with the Artemis Accords, and I'm still grateful for the former administrator for that opportunity, is to build a coalition of the willing in terms of what good looks like. Lead by example on the debris issue, and then use that to force United Nations or form a new kind of ITU to be able to develop it. Also, debris represents not just a problem, but as a private sector Redwire guy, it's an opportunity to innovate, to develop new technologies that can address this issue. We should have active debris removal missions so that we can develop new systems that not only will help address the debris problems, but create new satellite technologies and other systems that can benefit a wide variety of economic and national security areas for the country.
Mr. Bridenstine.
First of all, I want to double down on what he said. I think Mike is exactly right. Mr. Gold, as his name tag says, is exactly right. When we talk about, think about the FAA, and we go back to the 1950s when the FAA was created. In those days, the United States did it alone, and we were making great advances, and it worked. We were able to have a lot more airplanes into a lot less space. Interestingly, because we took the lead and we took that model around the world, an organization formed called ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization, and they took the leadership of the FAA and they applied it globally. So now when I fly my airplane, I'm a Navy pilot by trade, when I fly my airplane all over the world, I know exactly how to fly in whatever country I go to because we're all following the same rules. But it wouldn't have happened if we would have gone to some international organization and said, here's what we need to do, and try to get agreement from our competitors. That wouldn't have worked. But when the United States takes the lead, ultimately there becomes a standard that the other countries can join. And I think that's exactly the idea that Mike was talking about just a few seconds ago. we have to lead on this. And when we do, I think we're absolutely going to, change the world so that all of those constellations that we all believe in for low latency, high throughput communications can be successful.